Let your wind blow over my garden. Let your wind blow over my garden. Away go north wind and come oh south. Let your wind blow over my garden. Smell the spices dancing in the air. Let your wind blow over my garden. Smell the spices dancing in the air. Let your wind blow over my garden. Closed is my garden.
There are a number of announcements to make. I'm a family physician working in Worcester with Wolfie. I want you to take note. It's important for you to sign in if you haven't. Please do that today. The CPD certificates will be available at the reception of the Rural Clinical School at Bianca. That will be at the end or the closing of today. Then there's a shuttle going to Cape Town at the end, but you need to sign up during tea time. There will also be a change at the rehab track where Bernard Gieder's talk will swap over with Jana Miller's. So if you look at your program, those two talks is going to swap over. And don't forget about the poster presentation. There will also be prizes for all the presentations that took place during the conference, and that will be announced right at the end in the closing remarks. Okay, I'd like to introduce Professor Susan van Schalkwyk to you. She is the Deputy Director at the Center of Health Professions Education in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University. She's also the Associate Professor in Health Professions Education, and she's got a passion for developing academics. So if any of you keen to doing a PhD, you can speak to Susan. She is actively involved in helping people with their PhDs, and she's really got a lot of energy in building capacity in people. I must say I've attended some of her workshops and I thoroughly enjoyed it. She's also published quite widely and she's well known in circles of health education. So with great pleasure, I hand over to you, Susan.
Morning everyone. Goeiemôre. It's lekker om hier in die Boland te wees. Molweni. And really amazing to see all these sort of stalwarts of the conference, given that today's a public holiday. So I was a bit worried at 10 to 8. I think there were 5 of us in the room, so thanks for coming. I need to also say that I have been struggling with a cold for the past 5 days. And in spite of the fact that I've been surrounded by all you wonderful health professionals, something is waiting. Is that okay? See the word waiting there? Is that all right? Okay. Yeah, but in spite of the fact that there's all this knowledge in the room, no one has been able to cure me. So I have my pile of tissues here, and I do apologize in advance if I need to make use of them. Just less than 4 years ago, I was given the opportunity to join the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University. I've been working at the university for a number of years, predominantly in the Centre for Teaching and Learning. The people in the faculty called me an educationalist. I wasn't always quite sure what that was, but the one thing I did know was that I was passionate about teaching and learning. So the idea of moving into a focused space to practice my passion really appealed to me. What I didn't know when I took the job was that it would take me on an absolutely incredible journey. A journey that has brought me here today. And I need to say, and this is really not a cliche, this has been phenomenal to see the commitment and the passion of those of you sitting in this room. I thought I was passionate about what I do, but you guys have made me think about that again. It's really been a real privilege to participate in Rudasa this year, and I'm definitely coming back. When I started at the faculty, one of the tasks that I was given was to do research on the Rural Clinical School, which had just opened. And again, I didn't know what that was going to be all about. But essentially what we're going to be looking at today, I'm just going to see if this really, it doesn't seem to, it seems to be stuck somewhere along the lines. I don't know if our computer people can assist us possibly. I think it has something to do with the recording. Does it? Okay, great. Thanks. Stefan's is my neighbour, and he invariably solves my computer problems. So thank you, Stefan. I don't know what I've done if you could. Okay, so our story today is really drawing on the work that we've been doing, researching, investigating what is happening at the Rural Clinical School over the past 4 years. But I'm hoping that I'm going to take you on a journey beyond just the tangibles of the research. One that will maybe get us to probe and to think slightly differently. So even if you're not officially a teacher, those of you in the room today, or if you're not officially involved in training, I hope that you're going to see something of who you are and what you do in your day-to-day practice in what I'm going to be talking about. So we're going to look at what it means to be and become resilient. This doesn't seem to be working. No. It's still stuck. This is not a good way to start.
Put it in a slide.
Testimonies. Well, when I started teaching, we actually used transparencies and overhead projectors. So I'm used to that world. We'll try again. It was working earlier, which is what people always say, isn't it? I think while they're waiting to get that set up, we're going to try again now. Ah, hallelujah. All right. Thank you, Stefan. Now I really owe you 2 cups of coffee. Okay, let's start talking, or let's think for a few moments about resilience. So I went to the dictionary. I actually went to an online dictionary, which is not something I do often. I still believe in the old-fashioned way. But the dictionary definition gave me 2 perspectives on resilience, and I think they're quite useful ones for our conversation this morning. The first one has this notion of the ability of a substance or an object, interestingly not a human being, to spring back into shape, to bounce back. And the idea is then that you are flexible, that you are pliable. There's springiness. I rather like that word. And then this notion of giving, being able to give way. I thought that was quite an interesting way of thinking about resilience. I found the opposites of resilience quite interesting as well. This notion of being vulnerable and being fragile and being weak. I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with that. I think even in being resilient, we are very often vulnerable. But I'll leave it up to you to think about. The second perspective perhaps is more focused on the human aspect, and it's the capacity to recover from difficulties and to do so quickly, to be tough. Now, after what we've been hearing over the past couple of days, there's no doubt in my mind that if we're working in the health professions, you need to be able to bounce back quickly and you need to be tough. But then maybe we need to think about resilience in health professions education. Over the past 3 days, we've heard a lot about what's happening in the healthcare sector, and we've also heard a lot about what's happening in rural contexts. But I'd really like us to focus specifically on what happens in the teaching spaces before people move out into being fully fledged professionals and practitioners. And that's clearly our focus of this morning. And let's explore this idea of resilience in health professions education. Well, immediately it's clearly obvious. The fact that you have all spoken over the past couple of days of the challenges that you experience in your context means that our students, as they come through the ranks, need to be similarly able to cope with these challenges. And we know them by now. It's the incredible burden of disease that we have to deal with in South Africa. There are also government mandates, increased numbers. We need people at different places. It's all the issues around community service. And here I perhaps need to mention that although I have no background in health professions, I have a son who's a medical doctor currently specializing in psychiatry, and my daughter is an occupational therapist working at Ungeni Hospital in Schalkwyk. So I'm intimately aware from a mother's perspective what life is like out there. But there are also global realities. And in 2010, when the Lancet Commission came out with a report written by Frank and a whole host of colleagues, they suggested that, you know what, health professions education has not kept up with the challenges of what's happening out there. So it's not only a South African problem, it's a global issue that we need to, in the words of the WHO, transform and scale up the health professions education and training to address these shortages and this maldistribution of healthcare workers. So the things that we've been talking about for the past 3 days are very real, both for us here in South Africa and on the global stage. So what do we do? How do we ensure students who are resilient to go and cope? Well, the Carnegie Foundation suggested in 2010 that we need a different agenda. We need to start thinking differently about the way we do things and a different program and a different process for how we're going to do these things. And they mentioned a couple of things, and they weren't necessarily only talking about health professions in this context, but they suggested that teaching and learning needs to start promoting integration. And again, I'm sure that's music to Stefan's ears and those of you involved in interprofessional education and practice. But also to promote habits of inquiry and improvement. In 1967, Heidegger, who's a philosopher and one of the fathers of modern day thinking about teaching and learning, said that we must stop thinking about teaching as filling empty vessels with as much information as possible. We need to move beyond that. And this is going to be an important theme of what I have to say today. This notion of individualizing learning, but still maintaining quality by having secure and strong standards with our assessment practices. That's a real challenge for those of us who are working on distributed platforms. Challenge both for our students and for us as teachers. But most importantly, the Carnegie Foundation called for the development of a professional identity, the who that we want our students to become. Just to show you that these conversations have been taken up in health professions education as well, Karen Mann, publishing in Medical Education a couple of years ago, said that we need to change our ways of knowing. and the way we think about knowing. We need to change the language that we use, the discourse that we use, the words that we use. When we think about the notion of teaching, what is in our heads and who is the doer in that process? Now, I will be teaching the students too, as opposed to the students will acquire, understand, explore, engage, etc., etc. Cara Mann goes on to say that this should change our view of health professions education. And I'm going to come back a little later as to why this is all important, so bear with me. Just to summarize then, and Cara Mann says it rather beautifully there for us, that this sort of education, health professions education today, is understood as more than the acquisition of knowledge, skills and attitudes. And note that those three are together. We very often think that when we're doing something different, it's about attitudes. Mann says it's more than that. She says at heart it is the construction of a professional identity, remember the words of the Carnegie Foundation, and the transformation of the individual from a layperson to a professional. We were in one of the sessions yesterday, and Jana Miller, I don't see Jana. Oh, there she is. Jana was saying how important it is for them in the physio discipline to be looking again at what sort of professional they want to be moving out there. Okay. So what do? We've got this call for a new agenda. We've got a call to change our way of doing. I want to share with you a response. There are many responses. We've heard about them over the past 3 days. Phenomenal, wonderful things that people are doing. So there are many options. I just want to take you through a journey of what has happened here, well actually on the site next door and on the extended platform over the past 4 years. A response. Now, yesterday morning, Dr. Fish shared with you 10 guiding principles that have informed the Ukwanda Rural Clinical School. I'm not going to go through all 10 again. I've just got 5 here. And to just remind you what she said yesterday, that we want to recruit students and to teach students in rural spaces to encourage retention, a first guiding principle. To teach where the patients are, and then these 3 notions of continuity, drawing on the work of David Hirsch at Harvard that we heard about yesterday. So it's the continuity at patient level, at mentor level, and in the community. And when we look at our traditional, especially medical curricula, the way in which those curricula are structured defies this notion of continuity. We really need to be thinking about that. But fortunately, the Rural Clinical School, these were our guiding principles. And at the time of my appointment, we were very fortunate at Stellenbosch University to receive one of the MEPI grants. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Medical Education Partnership Initiative, but that grant was quite extensive. The US federal government allocating $132 million to 13 universities across Africa. So we were really, really lucky. And this enabled us to embark on a longitudinal study, which is a rarity in higher education, never mind in health professions education. So we must not underestimate how very important this was and the responsibility that it gave to us as a team. And just so that you know that I stand here really standing on the shoulders of giants, a la Google Scholar, and there are the names of the giants who've been working with me on this project over the past 4 years. And some of the people are in this room, and I acknowledge them. Professor Hufi Conradi, oh, there he is, and Professor Julia Blitz, and Dr. Therese Fish, who was with us yesterday. I also want to say that over and above this team, we've through the years brought a few more people alongside. And here I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Miranda Voss, who's been very involved in some of the work recently, Dr. Francois Kutsia, and Daniel's Felix, there she is right at the back. So, yeah, so it's really becoming a sort of a community. And I must acknowledge our funders then, MEPI at Stellenbosch University. We positioned ourselves as the Stellenbosch University Rural Medical Education Partnership, who has funded all this research. From the start, it was important to us that this research would make a difference. So a lot of health professions education research has been criticized for being descriptive, for telling the story, and those stories are important, but what we know from the literature is that it's not enough. We need to dig deeper. We need to go to a space where we can start generating explanations that have significance for our education and for the application of our educational practices. So this notion of wanting to produce quality work, and that's a challenge, it's not easy. When we started out, we had no idea where this was going. And we really had very little idea about how to craft it, to be honest. But it was important to us that we would be rigorous in our practice, that we would be ethical, and that the focus would be on really asking questions about the potential of these interventions, importantly to inform future practice and future policy. And again, we've heard about the importance of influencing policy across the country over the past 3 days. Now, I could spend the next whatever time I have left to tell you about what we did, but I really don't want to use up the time to do that. So just very briefly, we're in year 4, we're coming to the end of year 4 of the study. We've generated data across multiple sources. We've spoken to students, we've spoken to students who then became interns, we've spoken to their supervisors, the intern supervisors at the different sites, flown all over the country to meet with these students. We are following up our students right through to ComServe, so our first group of students, final years, 8 of them, 8 mavericks, 8 rogues, 8 future attendees of Rudasa and rural health conferences. They are now 4 years into the system, and they're busy with ComServe at the moment, and next year will be the final year that we'll be following them up. And we've repeated that for all the successive cohorts. We've also interviewed administrators, people who were involved in the establishment of the rural clinical school. We've interviewed community health workers, the clinician educators, the family medicine specialists, and patients who are visited in their homes. And this is all ongoing. Probably in excess of 300 interviews. We've conducted a series of focus groups, also with students at Tygerberg, the 6th years at Tygerberg, to sort of start looking at what's happening on either side. We've conducted a survey amongst our interns across the entire cohort to start seeing what's happening for our cohort so that we can start understanding where the differences lie. And then finally, we have also statistically analyzed the students' results for the past 3 years, comparing the results of the Tygerberg students with the results of the rural clinical school students. Initially, of course, the numbers were too small. This year was the first time that we had a sufficient cohort to start getting statistically significant results. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, I can stand before the RCS students and say to them that if you are here, you will not be academically disadvantaged. There's now evidence for that. I think what's important to say, though, having said all of that, to just summarize, what we'd been finding up until the end of last year was not anything new. So it was confirming a lot of what we saw in the amazing literature that is out there. Rural spaces are enabling on a number of levels, in terms of the students' learning, in terms of their self-efficacy, in terms of their confidence, in their skills. They talk about becoming self-driven, self-directed learners. So that stuff has been documented elsewhere, and we've also sought to document it. The role of the clinical supervisor is pivotal in this space. It's about relationships. And again, nothing new. Professor Blitz has produced a really amazing article looking at what is happening with the clinician educators that if you're interested in this field, you might want to have a look at. And then community immersion is potentially transformative. And that is a word you need to pick up on, because that's part of our theme here, this notion of changing, this notion of identity development and construction. There's a sense that something has to change, something has to transform. Okay, now I first need to tell you about my picture. I hope you can see it. I was in South Luangwa in Zambia 2 weeks ago. I don't think that's where I caught my cold. An amazing place for those of you who love the bush and love animals. And when I looked at this picture, it made me think of how the group is together and how the little baby elephant is being surrounded by all the others, how they move and walk together. What we did at the end of last year when we looked at all the analyses of our data up to that point was we said, okay, we've now fulfilled point number 1. We have described what is happening on the rural platform. But now we want to dig deeper. And we said we wanted to start understanding what's happening at another level. So we took a different approach and we drew on some realist perspectives. We also drew on the work of a critical realist known as Margaret Archer, and I'll tell you more about her towards the end. And we looked at our data differently. We went back to the data and we wanted to understand the mechanisms that were at work, that were leading to the outcomes that we were seeing on the platform. And here I just want to interrupt myself for one moment. What I'm presenting to you this morning is a really, really positive picture of the Rural Clinical School. And that is because that is largely what it has been. But I do need to acknowledge that with any innovation like this, and all of you will know, there are challenges and there have been. And not everyone has been hunky-dory and equally excited. But the purpose of this morning is to share with you our research into understanding the mechanisms that have had positive effects. So that is why a really, really positive story this morning. What we saw from this analysis led us to 3 domains of thinking about what happens at the Rural Clinical School. And I'm going to take you through those. And the first one of them was this notion of being part of a community. Let's have a look at some of the quotes from the students and we'll come back to this idea of community. I'm sure my IPE friends are going to love this. The relationship that you have with the allied health disciplines. I never really understood what OTs and what physios do and what dietitians do. But this year at the Rural Clinical School, you get to know them so well. And it's an open relationship. You can ask them questions anytime. You see the sense of community developing across the professions. And then another student saying there is always reciprocity. That's an important component of a community of practice. There's always reciprocity amongst the members of this team. And that is something that you do not easily find at the tertiary training hospital. And I know this is Hoffy's favourite quote, so I had to put it in. Because to me, there is a big difference between a group of people and a team. And maybe this is also for Louis and his work on teamwork. Teams work together. Groups just walk together. Okay. The notion of a community of practice comes from the work of Etienne Wenger. It's very well known in the literature. And Wenger has a couple of sort of fundamental perspectives around what a community of practice is. And we heard some of them from Bernard yesterday in the session we attended on force. The big thing with a community of practice is there has to be legitimate participation. And you hear that in the student's quote, being part of the team. But what you also need to do is to understand the space that you are in well enough that you can make a meaningful contribution to it. And as we go along looking at these quotes of the students, you're going to see that coming through more and more, such that you can be a trusted partner and have access to the shared repertoire, says Wenger, the language, the way of doing, the way of understanding. Time and time again in the feedback that we've received from the students was that what they learned at the RCS was to have a plan, to have a way of going about things. So in this way, students become fully fledged models, or fully fledged participants, modeling themselves on the insiders. And that's why I said earlier, ladies and gentlemen, all of you here have a responsibility in terms of teaching and learning, even though we're not perhaps always aware of it. But our very practice, everything that we do in the hospitals, in the clinics that we're working in, has a role in modeling these young people into our community of practice so that they will adopt the norms and values of the profession and hold that idea of norms and values, because we're going to come back to it right at the end. So Wenger describes being in a community of practice as a particularly powerful learning mechanism. And I know many of you are probably working in quite isolated spaces, and this might resonate with you. The potential to have a colleague come and visit you when you're on your own, to come and engage, to draw close to you. Those are such important components of our own professional learning and really important for us. And if you are in a space where you're very much in an outlier position, I would encourage you to find ways in which you can maintain your community of practice, because that will be an enabler for your own professional learning. We often forget about ourselves in this process, don't we? The second idea is this notion of place. Well, the tertiary training hospital, says the student, for example, you do not really take decisions for patients. So again, we're hearing this notion of participation. Often you are just ignored when on a ward round. Your contributions are not really taken into account. But here at the Rural Clinical School or on the distributed platform, you are part of a team. I need to say here that even as we were making these, looking at the data in terms of these 3 dimensions, we saw the interplay all the time. Margaret Archer talks about the interplay between the structural issues, the cultural issues, and the agent, the person. And we see this all the time. So really difficult to tease them apart. But here you take decisions about patients. Your input is actively listened to. You're recognized as part of the team. And this motivates you. And look what it motivates the student towards. Taking responsibility for his or her own learning and adopting an evidence-based approach, an evidence-based practice. Now, again, this thinking is not new. And Steve Reed brought out a wonderful article a couple of years ago called Pedagogy for Rural Health. It's one of my favorites. And I quote from that article, critical pedagogy, in other words, pedagogy that challenges us, that's transformative, transforms us, comes from the work of Paulo Freire, where he was challenging the social condition and demands active participation of the student and the teacher. We're in this together. And it's a process of challenging assumptions of learning and changing, again, this idea of changing. And Steve argues that in a rural setting, this sense of agency, again coming to Margaret Archer, is heightened by the relatively sparse resources as the students realize that their contribution is not superfluous, but is valued and utilized. Okay, so we see community of practice, and we see this idea of place, location, space. And then the final component is this notion of transformative development of a professional identity, the construction of a new identity. And Barnett, writing from a higher education perspective, but I think his words are very true for our own context, suggests that we need curricula that foster this wider form of human being. And I would argue that that's a lot of what's happening in the clinical context on the distributed platforms. Because it is an authentic learning experience that encourages the students to be what? To be resilient. To be resilient and confident to take risks. So we see how beautifully the theme of this conference talks to what is happening out there in the literature as well. And the notion of resilience and confidence being aligned with one another. And then maybe our earlier definition pointing to fragility and vulnerability, maybe there's some truth in that. And moving on from that, Dal Alba and Barnacle, together Barnett and Dal Alba and Barnacle are sort of the fathers of that. The title of my talk today, this notion of being and becoming, because they suggest that knowing what we know is always situated. It occurs in a place, in a space. And in so doing, it transforms from the merely intellectual, the thinking, the knowledge. Karen Mann earlier, it's about more than knowledge, skills and attitude. From the merely intellectual to something that is inhabited and enacted. And that's what's happening on our rural platforms. It's a way of thinking, making, acting. It's a way of being. It's a way of joining the community of practice. And then just two last quotes from the students. This is quite an old one. This comes from the very first year we did the study, but I really can't let it go. When you start medicine, you're all wanting to save the world, and you're enthusiastic and excited about becoming a doctor. And as the years go by, you lose that. There's lots of literature that talks about how students lose that passion. But things like Avian Park actually brings you back down to earth, and you're humbled, not only in terms of medicine, but in terms of just humanity. There's a lot more to life. And then in one of the later years, it affects you. It's again talking about the Avian Park context. It sort of opens your eyes to seeing that the patient is not just an individual. Interesting concept. They come with a family, they come with children and grandchildren. It's a contextual thing. We heard about this yesterday from our guest from Brazil. It's about the bigger picture. And you need to be aware of that and be sensitive to it as well. If our students can just learn to be sensitive to the needs of the patients, wow. And the student says, those are the moments I think I will always remember. Those are the things that have changed my thinking, hopefully transformed my identity. We tried to pull all of this together in a recent publication. And our model is trying to show the notion of being and becoming across these three dimensions. Across the dimension of community of practice, within a particular space, in our instance the rural platform, and the person, the role of the person, the transformation that's happening within the person, and the interplay between all of these. Because when we start looking at what's happening, understanding what's happening on the rural platforms, we need to realize that it is the interplay of multitude different factors. So back to resilience, as I bring our last couple of slides together. Our students are better prepared to bounce back, to give, we hope. Understand the principles of being part of a team. If you're part of a team, you need to be flexible. To be able to make decisions out of the box and be competent and competent. So you're tough. You know what you're standing on. You're able to put your hands on your hips. It's what I tell PhD students all the time. You need to be able to put your hands on your hips. And we can clearly see the links of resilience to risk and the pedagogy of hope, which is where a lot of the funding for the Rural Clinical School has come from. And you heard about that yesterday, Professor Botman's Hope Project. He started out calling it a pedagogy of hope. So what does this mean for us? And another picture from South Luangwa, which I don't think you can see very well. But my giraffe are looking in all different directions, as we might be doing right now. I was walking with those giraffe, I need to tell you. I was standing not 5 meters from them. It was quite an experience. What does this mean for us? Two last thoughts. First of all, going back to Wenger, the father of community of practice, I want to challenge you with this. Why does this matter to those of you sitting in this room? Maybe not all of you are teaching students. Wenger says that our perspectives about learning do matter, especially given our roles as role models, or given our task as role models. What we think about learning influence where we recognize learning, the sort of learning that's happening in the clinical context. How do we think learning happens? Have we challenged the notion that learning, according to what we're seeing in the literature, ought to be transformative? If learning doesn't change the way you think about something, it's nothing more than acquiring new bits of information. So it influences where we recognize learning, as well as what we do when we decide to do something about it, about learning. And it influences us as individuals, at the level of the community, or community of practice, and at an organizational level. In other words, by implication, the level of policy. But as a closing thought, I just want to read the last paragraph from our article upon which this presentation has been based. Dalrymple and Barnacle, who I cited just earlier, have argued that knowing and being are conjoined, interlinked. We have shown that in a rural place, knowing and being becomes capable of transforming who we are. And it is instructive to note how this experience is not always about academic learning and typically defies quantification or visible identification. And that's drawing on the work of Bleakley, who's written a wonderful book about medical education and identity. It is much more about the intangibles, the sharing of values, being respected and accepted as part of a team, being trusted and confident to assume responsibility for a patient who is both individual and community at the same time. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, it implies that we think differently about our teaching, that we have expanded agendas for our students' clinical learning, and that we intentionally consider what this means for transforming and scaling up the work that we do. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions for Susan?
Okay, my comment is thank you very much. 100%. I can agree. I'm from Grahamstown, where we have university and we have a township, and we're looking for ways. I'm in the middle. I'm in the Department of Health and NGO for Mr. Rudasa. We're looking at the ways of making meaningful connection, because community outreach is a thing for university to do, but actually to have so many. I found it challenging for lecturers to engage. Students will accept any way we teach them to a large degree, whether we want to do it. But if teachers don't think this is useful. So I was confronted with psychology department, because we have a project where psychology students are doing home program for children with disability. And my partner at Rhodes said, I don't think I can apply for funds for this project to NRF, because I don't think we're doing psychology with these children and families. I said, like, stimulation, counseling, empowering. This is not psychology. What is psychology? So I think this approach and this school of thinking is challenging for lecturers, and they might duck. So it's lots of work for us as colleagues who are teaching and coaching to actually take it upon and prepare, because not everybody is leaving lecture room with confidence, and their exposure is limited, and therefore they feel out of that when they go out. Yeah, it's one of the components of it. Thank you.
Perhaps just a response to that is, I think what we see clearly coming out of this is that even as we are being professionals, we are in a teaching space. And so by simply making over, because very often the values and norms that we hold, the things that have been espoused at this conference, are not often things that we talk about in the clinical context. We live them, but very often they might be tacit. And there's a lot in the literature about tacit knowledge and the need for the expert to make that more explicit. So what sort of conversations are you having with your students about how important it is that we have more rural health practitioners? So even in doing that, we are teaching.
Steve?
Thanks, Susan, for giving us a really good insight into what's coming out of the school. I'd be interested in what your data says. How students are talking about issues of power and of their sense of agency. Because I don't think it's enough to just place students in a rural setting and assume assume that something transformative is going to happen. Maybe in a few years we can make those assumptions, but it doesn't necessarily happen. I think for that truly transformative educational process to take place, there needs to come with it a conscious understanding of the inequalities and the sort of structural violence, as Paul Farmer puts it, of the situation in which we find ourselves in South Africa. And we're not Europe, and we're not the USA. We're South African based. So what are they saying about their role in the bigger picture? And how do they formulate that? How do they see that? How does it happen? Or not yet, I don't know. Maybe it's a function of once they are graduating and they see themselves more explicitly as change agents or not. How is it emerging? Nothing irritates me more than the student who's going to, who does a sort of community-wide project and assumes that they can just, change everybody's attitudes to whatever it is. Because it's such naive kind of set of assumptions, and our job as educators should be to challenge those assumptions and to transform them into I think you got some of it was in that quote about being humbled at Avian Park, but I'm interested in more detail from the data.
Yeah. So just as I said when I was talking about the aim of today was really just to explain the development of the model. So the application of the model going forward will give us a framework within which to look at the data perhaps differently. But just to say that we have published already on some of the aspects that you are talking about, and obviously this comes through on a number of different levels. What's been interesting so far, and I think that is the biggest challenge, is that it does appear as if what's happening here is something quite special, largely because of a lot of the personalities that are involved. So the commitment, for example, of the consultants at Worcester Hospital and the commitment of the family physicians at the smaller hospitals is remarkable. And we don't know whether that can be replicated or whether that is a truth elsewhere, and one needs to try and understand why that is so here. So as far as issues of power is concerned, it has emerged on different levels, and Miranda has taken lead on an article that is currently under review. We're looking quite critically, Miranda, at what's happening on the limb and some of the challenges that have experienced there. And although I don't think, do we actually refer to it as power? I can't remember now. But I think it's implicit in some of the conversations that's coming up there. But what's very interesting is now that we're interviewing the students who are in their first and second year of internship, is watching how the students are there dealing with the real world. And the comments of some of the intern supervisors have really been illuminating, where I think of one quote where the supervisor said, and it was really, really funny the way it came out, because he was talking about one of the students, now as an intern, saying that she was supposed to arrive at a meeting, and she ran into the meeting and said she can't come because she's busy doing a series of MVAs. Not sure what MVAs are. I'm sure you'll know. But that she had to first go back and finish them. And when she came back and sat down in the group, he says he was absolutely amazed about the way she'd managed the whole, the crisis process, taken, asserted her own agency into that process to say this is more important to coming to the meeting. And his final word was, you wouldn't think she wasn't trained at a tertiary hospital, which was really rather funny, And I mean, I can keep you busy for a very long time with those sorts of quotes. So the one thing that the students as interns all still talk about is how they struggle to deal with the heartache in the system. And students saying that even having been at the Royal Clinical School where they're exposed to a different context, they say nothing prepares you for that. So there is that. But notions of power, from what's come out of the data so far, it's seemingly that the students are quite assertive when they go into these spaces. But yeah, something to...
Question here, and then one more question there.
I'm actually a Jay Bezuidenhout, but of course I'm not the one who...
Sorry, I don't know where you are. Oh, sorry.
No, my name is Jay Bezuidenhout actually, but nothing to do with your research. The question I had is, would you think that maybe one of the natural extrapolations of the rural clinical school, we've seen in the Western Cape how you've extended it into training of family physicians, but something I've discussed with a few people from Area 3 in KwaZulu-Natal, where we are, is we see a lack of resilience in the specialists who come to our local referral hospital. It's interesting because, you know, we have one orthopedic specialist who's been there for 20 years and he's experienced exactly the same conditions, but he stayed. And we've seen, you know, other specialists have stayed for a fair time. But we see a pattern, for example, in internal medicine, where they employ a new specialist, they last a few months, they're burnt out from receiving referrals from 18 district hospitals, and they leave. So I wondered if maybe the next step in your research would be extrapolating to actually specialities, for example, obstetrics, where now they're looking to develop district health obstetricians, and seeing, you know, how can you alter the training of specialists to become resilient and to not respond to the challenges by, well, you know, developing a gate mentality. If it gets inside my gate, I'll look after it. I just wondered if you thought about that.
Golly, that's quite a big terrain to cover in the space of a few moments. The bottom line is yes, I think this is a very important area of concern and something that really requires our attention, and perhaps what we're learning from our research and our students can influence our thinking about supporting and enabling the clinicians, the consultants, and people even training at that level on rural platforms. It's interesting, there's a lot of literature has been done worldwide looking at challenges faced at distributed sites and the reasons why people stay and don't stay and what contributes to resilience and so on. So there is a lot of literature out there. And there's some, I mean, you're talking about the one person who stayed for 20 years. You know, what was it about that person that enabled her or him to stay for that amount of time? And on Monday evening we heard about some of those awardees having stayed for a long time in really complex places. My thinking is increasingly that we need to use what we know from the literature to start framing our conversations around these issues. So what is it? Is the community of practice in place? Is that person significantly supported and in a relationship with other members of his community or her community of practice? And part of the work that's being done by Sepetmber is enabling a coaching program for family medicine specialists here in the Cape Winelands, and with phenomenal success. So far the feedback from people is amazing. So simply by creating that community of practice, I think the issues around place that can be negative and positive, and again the literature has a lot on that. If you have small children, where they're going to go to school, what sort of care is there available for them? We need to look at how those issues play out in the longitudinality of someone staying in a particular space. And then at the level of the individual, you know, at the end of the day, you people in this room are special people. We heard mavericks, rogues, all sorts of names. It's because you have a different way of looking at things, and we need to recognize that that's not necessarily true for all people. But a long answer to really say, I agree with you, I think much more can be done, and perhaps we can use some of these understandings to inform that.
Thank you. I really love the detail that you guys got. I think it's
think that's a real challenge for many of us, but I'd like to turn that on its head. You know, there's nothing that makes people more curious than when there's a little bit of a buzz about something. And all you need to get teamwork going is for you to find someone and the two of you buzz somewhere in the passage where everyone can see. And the next thing you know is other people want to know what this buzz is all about. I may be being a tad facetious, but what I'm trying to say is teamwork begins with us. We are the team. We comprise the team. If we want to shift policy at the level of the HPCSA or any of the other council bodies, we need to agitate from our side. Our agency is critical. So if we create the teams within and of ourselves, they will become powerful and they will shift thinking. So it's really a challenge to say, you know, create a little buzz and make other people neskierig and curious, wanting to know what's happening and what's going on. Because human beings are by nature social beings. They want to be together. So creating a team is actually part of our natural inclination. We just need to agitate a little bit for it. It's one of the roles, the CanMed roles, is being an advocate. I think our time is
Thank you,
probably up.
Susan. Yeah, Susan, you displayed great passion again and resilience. You haven't used your tissues once.
I'm so grateful.
Thank you, it was really great. I'm so sorry to stop the session now. I'm sure we can carry on. But thank you again, and here's a small gift for your presentation.
And you know I do like that.
Good one.
Good morning. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just popping in here very quickly. I just wanted to ask, I am the Rudasa representative on the Stop Stockhouse project, which I'm sure some of you have heard about. There is a post up as well. It's an organisation it's a project that has come together through a whole lot of advocacy organisations. Section 27, TAC, MSF, HIV Clinician Society, Rural Health Advocacy Project, and Rudasa are part of the steering committee of this organisation. And we've realised that one of the big, and in a sense, because we all realise what the importance is of stockouts and how that impacts on health, particularly in rural areas, but all over the country. And so we have been trying to get healthcare workers and community members to report stockouts to a number and on the website. Now, the place to go to is stopstockouts.org. What we really need, though, is we need healthcare workers, whether you're an OT, a physio, a doctor, a nurse, who are in facilities to be sentinel surveyors. So that you, every 2 weeks or every month, are going to be contacted and asked, what is out of stock in your facility? And that you can do a quick kind of audit and quick check. You'll probably know what's out of stock if you're working and you're kind of struggling with things. And that can be fed back to the National Stockouts Project, which then, the whole idea of that is to be working with government, first of all, to be informing them about what's going on, and secondly, to help to sort out these stockouts. And they're working with district pharmacists and district managers, etc., to try and sort these stockouts out. So I have a list here. There are 28 spaces. You can just write on the back as well. Can we try and fill it up today? And I want to send it around now, and it would be so great if we could get people from each facility or that is represented here as a sentinel surveyor. It's completely anonymous, so you don't have to tell who you are. We usually, to try and sort out the stockouts, will say there's a problem at this facility or that facility. But otherwise, unless you want to say who you are, your name won't be mentioned at all. But please, will you write that down? That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I remember one of the teleconferences we had when we were discussing on the theme of this conference. And we ended up having the theme building resilience in facing rural realities. And we had quite a bit of brainstorming around it and grappling with how to word what we had in mind. And thank you, Susan, for clarifying more on resilience. And building resilience is an interesting term or description of how to increase resilience, because you normally build structures. And resilience is something, you have a portion of it. All of us have some personal resilience, but what I'm hearing throughout the conference more and more, and even in Susan's presentation, is it's actually about building relationships. That's what makes us resilient in challenging environments. That's what gets us to pull through and face another day. Even in the workshop we had with Louis Jenkins about district hospitals, much of it was about building relationships, working in a team, effecting change in the community. So I'd just like to leave that thought with you. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Martin Buck, who's originally from the Netherlands and came to South Africa and ended up Schalkwyk. If you translate that directly, that is happy team. And it sounds like you've achieved that. 4 children, 3 daughters-in-law and 2 grandchildren.
Very good, Frank.
Congratulations. Yes. Got your Schalkwyk. So here in South Africa has faced quite some challenges and went back to the Netherlands for about 20 years, and we're very fortunate that you came back and is now involved, intimately involved in the clinical associates program and training them, and also overseeing rural rotations at the University of Pretoria. With great pleasure, I hand over.
Good, thank you very much. I'm not going to use it, but maybe you can later on play the video. Yeah. Alright, good morning everybody. I don't need to answer the question where I come from. Francois has done that already. This week somebody asked me if I came from Cuba. Not really, but people go from Turkey. When he had a big beard, they thought I came from Turkey. Some of my patients in the Netherlands asked me that question. Spain, France, but my roots go back to the south of France. I think my ancestors were Huguenots. They fled France, went to the Netherlands, and then I came out in '77 to South Africa. And yes, Steve, I was very naive when I came out. I was, but I didn't do a 6 weeks rotation. I stayed 10 years at Schalkwyk, and the place was called like that because there was a little lake there, and they said one state they found a diamond there, and that's why they called it Schalkwyk. We said later on, no, we have stayed there 10 years, and we had 10 very good years there. 3 of our kids were born there. Schalkwyk, happy team. And I think that's how we left the place. And after 35 years, I still go back there from time to time and see how the place is and what's happening there. All right, Suzanne, thank you for introducing resilience, and all of us have got some resilience. I want to have a few disclaimers. I'm not an expert in resilience, that's one. And I'm not probably as resilient as some of you are. So I'm also a learner and not an expert. When I think of resilience, I think of trees and a storm. If you've got a willow tree, it can bend, and it comes back if the storm is over in shape. And when there are frequent storms, its root system will grow deeper and stronger. Now, Suzanne said something about the opposite of resilience, rigidity. You can think of an oak tree. The storm is strong, the oak tree will not bow, but will break and be destroyed. So I think that is the sort of picture I have with the resilience. So, have you ever wondered why people become or remain calm in the face of disaster while others seem to fall apart? Yes, partly it has to do with your genes, I suppose, if you've got the right genes or not. People that are able to keep their cool have what the psychologists call resilience. The ability to cope with setbacks, problems, disasters, including job losses, financial problems, medical emergencies, financial or family problems. Later on, we will look a bit more in detail into this. But if you do not have much resilience, you will probably end up not coping well, slowly recovering from setbacks, or end up with psychopathology as a result. Resilience does not eliminate stress, of course, or erase life's difficulties. Instead, it gives people the strength to tackle problems head-on and to overcome them. You can see that in our own country when people get resettled. They are moved from where they originally stayed. We have seen that in the 70s and 80s. But also when there are floods or when people are the victim of violence. According to many experts, people are very capable of learning skills that help you to become more resilient. So it's not only a matter of your genes. It's not predetermined how resilient you will be. You can learn it. And I think that is necessary. When I think of our clinical associates who have got a job, a profession now, but no scope of practice, no career path, I think they have to become quite resilient, to keep going and carry on until the time that things have been put into place. And that's why it helps to twin with the American universities, because they share with us that the profession is there already for 50 years, and it's only after years and years of motivation that you got prescription right and other things. Another good example, I think, was the gala evening when Hein talked to us. I think if you talk of resilience and keep going, I think that was a very good example. You can think of TV programs, Against All Odds. I mean, how people with handicaps and all sorts of setbacks overcome them. That is resilience. Much research has been done on resilience and neurobiology, and I think I'm going to skip that. I'm not going to talk much about that. But I mean, we know how it works. When there is a stressor, how it sets into action our stress system, and how we get a stress response. Now, what is a stressor depends a lot on our perception, our cognition. Is a full waiting room? Is an emergency scissor? Is a management that doesn't function well? Is that a stressor for us? How important is it? So, the way you see things is important. But anticipation, attention and motivation can inhibit the stress system and moderate or stop the stress response and the outpouring or neurotransmitters, cortisol, norepinephrine, dopamine, and the others. And of course, all of you know that social support and altruistic behavior of your colleagues can moderate the stress response. And as a last resort, some of us might go to medication to moderate, to change, to limit the stress response and control the stress system in your body. Right? So, it's especially in difficult circumstances which are not favorable, that you can develop resilience. So most of us, most of you, are placed in situations where you can grow, train, develop resilience. And I've often watched also our students, the BCMP students and other students, with all sorts of problems, financial problems, social problems, academic problems sometimes, but they kept going. They pushed on, and they made it. So I think training, also training in rural places, can be part of resilience training. It's not so that in the BCMP program we have got a special aspect of part what looks at it. David Rogers is going to do some research on that and see how resilient our students are, and if they become more resilient when they go from first to second and third year. And of course we all know the saying of Mandela, the greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And I think he's also a very good example how people become and maintain their resilience. So it's not only a question how I endure the circumstances, but also make the best of it. Last year I read the book of Viktor Frankl. He's a psychiatrist who survived 3 concentration camps. And then after he came out, he wrote 3 books, or a whole number of books in fact. But one of them is In Search of Meaning. And he says that the way you handle hardship and suffering, and he could speak from experience, can also give meaning to your life. So, he says that after difficult period in your life, you can in fact come out wiser and stronger. Think of that willow tree with deep roots. Now research has shown that people have sometimes resilience sort of naturally. Apparently they've got the right genes. Or, and that's the question, a worldview, what helps them. But these behaviors can also be learned. I'm just going to say a few things. You can build positive beliefs in your abilities, know your strengths, and build on them. It has been mentioned this week already. But also spiritual connectedness, by having a secure attachment. Have a passion, and I mean, it has been obvious this week. Quite a lot of people have got a passion for disabled people, for the rural clinic, for the hospital, for the area where they work. Find sense of purpose in life and develop strong social networks. Suzanne mentioned it. To be part of a community is so helpful. It can protect you, can help you to build your resilience. So, that's about resilience. What has worldview to do with resilience? I've read up a little bit and learned from it. I looked at what Apostel wrote. Apostel is a Belgian philosopher and a professor in Gent. And he say a worldview has got at least six elements. The first element is an explanation of this world. This has to do with the question of the origin of the world. Why is the world as it is? Was there a designer? How did the universe start? And what about the earth? Where does the variety of plants, the animal life, I mean, you've seen nice pictures. But I mean, most of us will love nature, I think. Where does it come from? And what about all the microorganisms? The good ones, but the bad ones, like Ebola and the HIV and all the others. Another element of a worldview is answering the questions, where are we heading? Futurology. This is a question everybody asks himself. When you look at the development of the past century, all the technological revolution and new techniques, exciting new discoveries, but the Earth's resources are limited. Food, water, soil, energy. So where are we heading? People have different expectations based on their past experience and what they think is possible to achieve. Can we make the future or not? The third element is values. Answers to ethical questions. What should we do? What is right? What is wrong? Your worldview determines to a large extent your values. And they will have an impact on your practice. It's not only your skills, your training, but also your worldview. What determines where you go and what you do. Take an example of the homeless beggar at the traffic light. Should you ignore him? Because if you give him money, he will spoil it on alcohol or drugs. Or must you always be prepared and ready to help and give him something? If you work in a rural hospital, and like we did, often people will come and knock at your door, ask for work, ask for school fees, ask for food, ask for other things. And what do you do with the handicapped baby? Depends a lot on your worldview. Have you got a classical or a Christian worldview? That makes an enormous difference how you will treat this baby. I'm from the Netherlands. And one of our teaching hospitals in the north, Groningen, has got a Groninger protocol. What more or less is a protocol what you do with handicapped babies. In that hospital, they kill actively handicapped babies. So depending on your worldview, you will either treat them with compassion and love, or you might say, no, this is not worth living. Let's terminate life. I was at the home of one of these babies, and he was about 6 years old. He escaped. Another element of worldview is the theory of action, the methodology. How should we attain our goals? A worldview has an impact on your plan of action. A good illustration is, for example, how to prevent new infections, HIV infections, for example. How do you reduce them? Technical approach, by using condoms, ARVs, reduce the viral load. Or, if you are a Christian or a Muslim, you might start with a relational approach, focusing on avoiding premarital sex, multiple partners, and promoting faithfulness and abstinence. So depending on your worldview, you might think it's fine to practice concurrency and accept unfaithfulness or multiple partners or polygamy. And depending on that, your plan of action might focus either on ABC or on condomize and treat. All people are HIV positive, and of course in our country we have got a combination of both. The next element of a worldview is the theory of knowledge. What is true and what is false? Of course we know a lot of things. The cause of Ebola is a virus. We know the virus, and we know that there are different viruses. Apparently, in the different countries, there are different viruses at play. But why does this epidemic develop now? And why in that part of the world? Is it one of the possible apocalyptic signs of the end of the world? Or do you say nonsense? Nonsense. We had plague, we had HIV, we had many other epidemics. You know, a balanced diet should contain fat, carbohydrate, protein, and at the moment there is a big debate about, what is correct, especially here in the Cape. But I mean, it's very interesting. It's not only here in the Cape, it's all over. Because science, I think, has not answered the question yet, how many carbohydrates are good for us? And what type of carbohydrates are good for us? So what is true? And how does it exactly work? If it is true that fructose is a slow poison, when you take it in the amounts that some people do, then the food industries are the culprits. And the big lorries with the coke, who travel to the most rural places, are in fact distributing poison. And then the obese people are the victims. Our worldview will determine what we accept as true and false, especially where science cannot provide a definite answer. Science has discovered how many things work, how processes in nature and in the human body work, but has no answer to many of the why questions. And the last element of a worldview is that it has got an etiology. It has got an origin, and you construct it. You build on what you got, I suppose, from home. The Christian thinker James Sear defines a worldview as a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart, not the mind, the brain, the heart. A commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or a set of assumptions which we hold about the basic construction of reality. And it provides the foundation on which we live, move, and have our being. And he suggests that we should all think in terms of worldviews. That is, with a consciousness, not only of our own way of thought, but also that of other people. So that we can first understand and then genuinely communicate with others in our pluralistic and multicultural society. So, resilience and your worldview. Having a goal and a vision and hope is very important to keep going and develop resilience. And it's here that the world view that people and you have play a role. It's your worldview. It is your worldview that can give you a solid foundation to build on and to determine the route you want to go. The vision you have, the perspective for your career, for your institution, what you want to achieve. This is not only shaped which university you were trained, and if you did a rural rotation, or if you were taught here at the rural medical school, but it has also to do, to a large extent, with your worldview and your belief system. Why do you want to achieve what you want to achieve? What inspired you to do so? And do you still have the passion for the work as when you started? Gunstad, a Norwegian anthropologist, observed interesting differences between African and European, Norwegian communities. He says, here in Africa we see a broad network contributing to different types of support. Neighbors helping with food, workmates helping with transport, church members with emotional and spiritual support. The religious support is another interesting component of his study. He says, among Norwegian reports of adversities in childhood, only a few, 2 or 3 out of 30, refer to religious support. While in Southern Africa sample, it is the most common reference. This reflects maybe that in Norway, in Europe, for many people, religion appears to belong to a private sphere that they do not discuss openly. People estimate that 70% of the Norwegians believe in God, but do not attend church. The church seems, in Africa, to be strong and well-working network, which plays an important role. And then he says, it seems that where religion is part of life and culture, it generates resilience. If that is true, how is our relation as healthcare workers with the churches in the area where we work? And how far do we use them for health promotion, disease prevention, and caring for the sick? The same Gunstad has got a nice model for developing resilience. He has got 3 groups of factors. The first one is network factors, and I think, Suzanne, you said already, being part of a community, having a secure and a safe attachment in your family, your friends, an institution, like here, can help a lot. Being part of a community can protect, can help to build your resilience. The other aspect, the other group of factors is abilities and skills. Your problem-solving skills, social skills, strengths from earlier experiences and challenges. And then, interesting, he says the third group of people is the meaning you give to things, the values and the faith, the sense of coherence, the sense of meaning, and values you hold, like hope, honesty, friendship, solidarity, but also faith, fellowship, and prayer. These factors, he says, can help you to develop and maintain a positive self-image, build confidence and resilience, and reduce the risk of loneliness. You get stuck, get a burnout, get addicted, or depressed. Because this will help you to find solutions and new perspectives. So I think in what we have seen and heard today, this fits in quite well with what the previous speaker Suzanne said about being part of a community. So the values you hold as a person, how you value justice, solidarity, equity, will be, to a large extent, be determined by your worldview. And also this will determine how committed, how motivated you are to build quality rural health services. How do you think about ill health, the epidemics? Where does the violence come from? What are the solutions? How do you see the future of this country, the area where you work, the province? And where are you going in this whole process? That will be partly determined by the coordinates of your GPS, your TomTom for your life. And I think your coordinates are, to a large extent, determined by your worldview. So spirituality is an integral part of the human being and unique for humans. For thousands of years, there have been different religions as an expression of people's spiritual aspirations and needs. For many people, spirituality is a way of engaging the purpose and the meaning of our human existence, and provides a reliable perspective on what they experience and how our orientation to the world and the environment is. And inevitably, if healthcare has got any regard for the humanity of the patients and their families, and also for the healthcare workers, it is faced with spirituality in its experienced and expressed forms. Jared Diamond, who wrote the book The World Until Yesterday, what has just come out, gives 7 reasons why people have religions and describes how this has changed over the past 10,000 years. He gives the following reasons. He says, religion serves to explain things by a supernatural explanation, to diffuse anxiety through rituals, providing comfort in pain and death, creates a standardized organization in society, preaching political obedience, moral codes of behavior to strangers who belong to the same religion, and a justification of wars against people with other religions. But he says that religions do not show any sign of dying out, because it's due to our persistent quest for meaning. The function of religions that have expanded over the past 10,000 years is to provide hope, comfort and meaning when life is hard, and give a meaning to suffering. We humans have always sought meaning in our lives that can otherwise seem meaningless, purposeless in a world full of unpredictable and unfortunate events. And then comes, in the past century, science. And science tells us that the meaning is meaningless, and that our lives are just packages of genes, for which the measure of success is just self-propagation. Our request for meaning is in vain, and you can rather stop looking for it, because there is not any meaning. I think it's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that there is an increasing body of knowledge and evidence that there is an important role for spirituality. This is the new textbook on spirituality in healthcare, just published recently. And they argue that there is a relation between faith and health. And of course there are other textbooks as well, of Koenig and websites of the Duke University. And it seems that engagement of spirituality in healthcare can be seen as a strategy for humanizing healthcare. So its focus on inner meaning, approaches to suffering and compassionate care. It opens the way for a more holistic and compassionate system of care. And then, of course, we are at the end of the conference, so a bit of reflection is not bad, I think. What impact has your own spirituality, faith and religion on your function as a healthcare professional? And of course, I know faith and religion is not the same. Religion is just, the religion you follow is just the way you express your faith and spirituality. If you look a little bit back in the literature, you can see that in old civilizations, disease was viewed etiologically and not symptomatically. So diseases must have a cause, and the diviners were there to ascertain who and what the cause was of your misfortune or your illness. When you're breaking a taboo, not observing the will of your ancestors or God, and the attempts to account for suffering and ill health are called theodicies. The sick person was suffering for a reason and had to repent. And as a result, the sick person was not viewed with compassion, but as the recipient of a deserved punishment. Think of the story of Job in the Old Testament. And the classical religions of philosophy did not encourage compassionate care, and this changed quite a bit with the introduction of Christianity. The parable of the Good Samaritan has inspired millions of people to have another attitude to people who are traumatized or suffering. Suffering became a reason and an opportunity to provide care for the sick and the dying. Christianity introduced a very different set of values from those that dominated the classical world, and they became the building blocks for medical practice for many ages. Compassion was not a part of the Greek medical ethics, but it became an inspiration for care of the sick later on. Go and do likewise. That's what Jesus said to the Jews. And as a result, early Christian medical charity was developed while churches were still small, scattered, and persecuted by the Roman Empire. And medical philanthropy later also spread to other faith traditions, like the Jews, the Muslims. You can think of the Samaritan Purse, who's working now in West Africa, Gift of the Givers here in South Africa. And I think many of you work, in fact, in hospitals, which were originally built by missions. But when medicine became a secular profession and less of a calling, the importance of vocational calling and compassionate care became less obvious. And these values lost much of their importance. Medicine became reductionistic and its ethics started to move back to the old Greek and classical values. You can think of the book of Peter Singer, book on ethics from Australia. It's clear that spirituality or the lack thereof determines the ethics and the practice in the field of medicine. Many healthcare workers do not see it as their role any longer to be involved in the spiritual aspects and management of the patients, due to various reasons. One of them, the lack of training. And that brings me to the role of hope in healthcare, and also in resilience. All of you, and I've also seen it, that when there is no hope, that leads to despair, depression, giving up. What is hope? A literary definition by Emily Dixon is, hope is as a bird singing the sweetest song in the face of a storm. And of course there are many other definitions of hope. Hope for the soul is what breathing is for the living organism. Where there is no hope, where hope is lacking, the soul dries up and withers. And what are the origins of hope? That probably depends what your worldview is. The psychologist Erikson proposes that hope is part of an innate development process within humans, And that hope originates in the child as a consequence of positive interaction with the carer. But in the Greek mythology, hope was seen as an evil that encourages foolish over-optimism, while sometimes it was a blessing as well, to console humanity faced with a multitude of evils. In the Christian theology, hope has been understood as derived from God, His promises to us, and our relationship with Him. So, hope can have different origins, and the word hope has different meanings to different people. But always, hope is vital for well-being. It's transformative and often transcendent. It requires energy and imagination of what can happen in the future. And it can act as a dynamic resource that gives vision and energy to work for an uncertain goal. Despite the diversity and interpretation of hope, it consistently emerges as a force for the good, fundamental for well-being and health. It's associated with positive experiences with others, like here, or at other conferences, the ICMJ Congress, where lots of people were together and shared the vision. It influences self-esteem, determination, and strength. And in this way, hope strengthens resilience, because we get inspiration, creative imagination, and see positive possibilities. Hope is simple and complex at the same time, and encourages us to dream, to aspire, and to work to attain change in the face of what looks like unsurmountable odds. Would like to show you a video what illustrates that, I think, quite well. This video is from Alberto Cairo, and it tells you his story in Afghanistan and what happened to him there. He's working there for 21 years, 23 years now, and as you know, Afghanistan is not the most simple country. And at the moment, his organization employs 250 handicapped employees, but you will see the story here.
And I understood that what made him stand tall. Yeah, with the legs, yes, thank you very much. But as a first, it was the dignity. He has regained his full dignity thanks to that job. So, of course, I understood, and then we started a new policy completely different. Now we decided to employ as many disabled as possible, to train them in any possible job. It became a policy of positive discrimination, we call it now. And you know what? It's good for everybody. Everybody benefits from that. Those employed, of course, because they get a job and dignity. But also for the newcomers. There are 7,000 every year. People coming in for the first time. And you should see the face of these people when they realize that those assisting them are like them. Sometimes you see them, they look, and you see the face, and the surprise turns into hope. And it's easy for me as well to train someone who has already passed through the experience of disability. They learn much faster. The motivation, the empathy they can establish with the patient is completely different, completely. Scalpel do not exist. People like Mahmoud are agents of change. And when you start changing, you cannot stop. So, employing people, yes, but also we start projects of microfinance, education, and when you start, you cannot stop. So you do vocational training, home education for those who cannot go to school. A physiotherapist can be done not only in the orthopedic center, but also in the houses of the people. There is always a better way to do things. Yeah, that's Najmuddin, the one with the white coat. Terrible Najmuddin is that one. I have learned a lot from people like Najmuddin, Mahmoud, Rafi. They are my teachers. I have a wish, a big wish, that this way of working, this way of thinking, is going to be implemented in other countries. There are plenty of countries at war like Afghanistan. It is possible, and it is not difficult. All what we have to do is to listen to the people that we are supposed to assist, to make them part of the decision-making process, and then of course to adapt. This is my big wish. Well, don't think that the changes in Afghanistan are over, not at all. We are going on. Recently we have just started a program, a school program, basketball for wheelchair users. We transported the wheelchairs everywhere. We have several teams in many parts of Afghanistan. And in Guinea, when...
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. Time for a question.
Good. I think if you see the video, it illustrates what resilience is, both in the patient, but also in the healthcare worker. Yes, resilience. I hope that through Rudasa and through sharing this sort of experience, your resilience will grow based on a supportive network, like here, your abilities and skills, what you all have, and not least, not last, not least, the meaning you give to the work, to your work, derived from your values and your faith. I hope that you will take the message from the video and implement and practice and grow your resilience in the year to come. I thank you.
I'm aware that we're running out of time, so I'm going to limit it to 3 questions and try to be quick and brief, please. Question? Still taking in, absorbing all that. I must say, I became emotional when I saw that video. I'm a bilateral amputee, so I've got some idea of what they're facing. If you don't believe me, you can touch some wood. I saw a question there. You can just...
Thank you. I wanted to stand up and say thank you immediately when you finish, because that video sees everything. So, just as well. Thank you. That video sees everything about what our passion is as Rudasa. And from those early days with Hope Cornelia and Undina Rauta, what they have done in those communities all over South Africa. And I just wanted to say really, that is very moving to see, to hear what you said and then to end it with such hope. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Another question? You've silenced them.
In terms of resilience, how actually our patients or clients are helping us. Because what this guy was wishing for is what we sometimes think, maybe they don't come. Maybe they don't come back because I don't know what I can offer. It's beyond my scope, you know, it's too difficult for me. Yet, the patients came because they had faith in you. And they had this faith that together we can do something. They were offering actually solutions. So I think this is the source of resilience also. We must believe in that it's not only what we have already, but what is actually between us that takes it.
Right, and what is in your community? The resources there. Yeah.
So thank you, Martin, for teaching us and leading us towards hope. And I see with students that come through our institutions is that the biomedical model which they get stops where the biomedical model stops, and once you get to a disability that we know there's nothing more we can do. They're not even taught how to lead someone into hope. Could you have any comments on that? How do we get our students to say, okay, well, you're taught up to there, it's like a wall which they know they can't cross, and how do we get that across to them?
How do you get it across? I think it's difficult. It's not taught in medical schools. I think none of us we are all taught how to prescribe drugs, how to do procedures, and how to do that correctly. But I think very few of us are taught how to comfort, and how to give hope, how to encourage people. And I think if we are aware of our lack of skills there, the deficiency in our training, I would say, then maybe we start to regard pastors, spiritual counselors as our colleagues, just like social workers or physiotherapists, and we can learn from them, and we can make them part of our team, like it was in the past. I'm sure in the mission time it was like that. And of course we are not trained to touch and to get involved in that dimension. It's a bit sensitive, I agree. Depends on your own worldview, it depends on your own upbringing, if you're comfortable, if you know how to approach the topic. But I think often, as doctors, we do not only avoid it to give people hope, or maybe we just say maybe a new drug, or a new technique, or a new, expert where I can refer you. Super specialist. But I mean, what about the other things of hope? The caring community, environment, the family. Yes, your faith. Is your hope only based on circumstances, or is your hope based on other things? So that depends on your worldview, your faith as a doctor and as a patient. But I mean, why not explore that and find out how the patient experiences it? It opens new doors for doctor-patient relationships.
Can I allow one more question there? Okay.
Just a short one. The WHO, in about 2 weeks' time, will bring out a manual into professional care, and they talk not just about a biopsychosocial model like, in addition to the biomedical model, but they talk about a biopsychosocial spiritual model of care, which, is being recognized now at WHO level. So that's great progress in supporting what you've been saying.
Yep.
Okay. Got space for another one. We'll wait.
Basically, I was going to just say, I think that it's so important. I think when you're rural, you see that the spirituality of people is so important. So the biopsychosocial, spiritual way of living patients is really, really important. I just want to say thank you. I think that a lot of people here,
Their resilience and their hope and their passion is based on their faith. I think it's really great that you brought that up, and I think it's a very important aspect of what people are about. So thank you.
Yes, thanks. It's often under the surface, I think. And if we are a bit more explicit about it, I think it can open up new energy. Sharing our vision, sharing our hopes. I was at the ICMJ Congress in Rotterdam in July. There we had 900 people in the room, from all over. From Eastern Europe, from South America, but also from the Middle East, where the fighting is going on. From Iraq, Iran, all over. And what brought us together was our common faith. Sharing how we were serving in different areas, but also sharing the challenges, the successes, our motivation, and then going out from there, knowing there are lots of people in the world doing the same sort of work based on the same conviction and vision. And I think in another way maybe Rudasa can be, a platform like that. And I do not see why we shouldn't bring in this dimension as well, because I think many of us are motivated by that. And our resilience comes from that. Depending on your own worldview and if you are part of a spiritual or a faith community, etc. But I mean, it's one dimension what maybe has not been explored so much, but it's there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Don't you all think it's so significant that we're talking about resilience and about spirituality in a church?
Yeah.
Yesterday we had a minister preach to us good news.
Pleasure. Okay, Frans.
Thank you so much.
Right. Okay.
Just a short comment on this discussion. When I was a student, we were kind of, sometimes in between the lines, sort of kind of told avoid spiritual issues, especially when it came to mental health. The irony in that, so much irony, and it's exciting for me and actually very invigorating, making me happy to talk about spirituality and health and wellness. My life coach asked me, how is my spiritual wellness? Which I thought was such a different approach. I've never had somebody ask me that. And my personal experience in engaging with patients on a spiritual level is that they often experience that you appreciate them more and they're very positive about it. I would go as far as to say it's part of our cultural competence. I'm learning also from the Sangoma that's in our clinic and how they understand the world around them. So thank you very much for this talk. I've got two important announcements to make. The closing of the conference will no longer take place in the tent. It will take place in the auditorium of the Rural Clinical School. Okay, got that. Then, the workshop on the National Strategic Planning Indicators is not going ahead, unfortunately. Okay. So with that, no longer delay, go and enjoy your tea. And the posters.
Let your wind blow over my garden.